Well, thank you guys all for being here to join us for a panel on a topic that has risen to national prominence of late, but which these experts on stage with me have been intimately familiar with for quite some time. So we're really thankful to have all three of you guys here as well. Before we start, I want to just say two quick things. Number one, we're going to be taking questions toward the end of this panel with the hashtag #AskEncryption. So if anything piques your interest throughout the panel, make sure and tweet us, and there is a potentially high likelihood that we would be able to ask your question. And second of all, I just want to take a quick poll. How many of you in this ballroom are in favor of strong end-to-end encryption? Raise your hand. So I would say that's probably, what, 75%?
It's a lot.
Less than I thought.
How many of you in here believe that data should be recoverable in cases of national security? Raise your hand.
Very small percent.
Far fewer of you. So that's why we're having this conversation, because that seems to be the crux of the argument that we're having in the court of public opinion right now. And so on the technical side, we want to explore if this is not about one iPhone, if this is not about a deceased shooter from San Bernardino and one iPhone and one case, then what is this debate about? Charles, what do you think it is?
Well, I think there's a much larger picture here. You have to look at the entire ecosystem and the implementation of encryption and sort of the roadmap of where we go from here. And if you think of things in the commercial light, a client that we have would come to us for incident response planning. They'd come for us for a roadmap of what happens when certain triggers occur. And many of those triggers have never occurred before. But what they plan for is the eventuality that the triggers, the events will happen. And they have a set rules of the road, rules of engagement for that eventuality. And I think we need a similar process and plan within the industry when it comes to encryption.
And we're going to talk a little bit in this conversation about how to write those rules of engagement between tech and between the government. But Michael, how do you see this argument?
I think part of the challenge here is that the argument we're having is both smaller and more black and white than it should be. Like at the end of the day, even larger than the entire ecosystem of the technical ramifications of security and data and privacy is a much larger conversation that we are not having as a result of this sort of false choice between weak encryption and strong encryption. I think even for those of us who are thinking about the realities of intelligence gathering and law enforcement and the challenges that they face in keeping us safe, that there are very few people who think weakening encryption is actually a good path. That it is, the choice is really between strong encryption and none. Right? The idea of weak encryption is really kind of a non-starter. And the challenge for me here about why this isn't about an iPhone is that this is about a lack of framework. It is about a world and regulators and policymakers who have not kept up with the complexities of the reality that they are, in which they are making policy and creating regulation. And that we don't have an answer for this. We haven't had the public discussion about what our values are relative to civil liberties and limited government and limited power, right? And the relationship between the particular value of this particular tool for the investigation and prosecution of crimes in the context of law enforcement, and the particular value of this tool meaning the ability to decrypt data at rest. The value of that relative to the potential risk to civil liberties or the risk of abuse that comes from creating a mechanism. But the conversation has become so narrow that we're not really having a values conversation, and our leaders have not done enough to articulate why these things are such foundational. These are foundational fabric of our society questions, and that's not the level of conversation that we're really having at the moment. And I think until we get those things into the public discussion, we're really setting policymakers up to fail, and we're setting law enforcement in this case, who setting aside the blurring of the lines between law enforcement and intelligence gathering, which are super problematic, we're putting law enforcement in the position where, because we have demanded 100% security, and we're not having a sober conversation about the risks and consequences of our values, that they are legislating through the, not legislate, they're working through the courts to dictate technical solutions to problems, which is just backward and cockamamie in so many different paths. Can't believe I worked cockamamie into the conversation already. It's so early.
It's early.
It's just the idea that technical solutions are coming through courts is just really, really a terrible, terrible path to be on.
Misha, do you view this as an argument between 100% encryption and 0% encryption as well?
I think that's an important debate to have, and I think a lot of people assume this particular case is about encryption, but it doesn't seem to be if you read the details of the case. And I think details actually matter in this case. This case has obviously captured a whole lot of imaginations of a lot of people, and it's been fascinating to watch the spectrum of public response to this, because Snowden disclosures obviously had a lot of reaction from people, and then slowly over time, right, over the course of 2 years of them being released, it almost became kind of background noise in the media, right? And we really missed that opportunity. I think Michael's exactly right. That debate about the balance between what government should be able to do lawfully, right, and the rights to privacy never did happen. It didn't happen in the right forums, and now it's washing out in the courts in the most unfortunate cases. This case, at least to me, does not look like a case about encryption. The government has not asked Apple to weaken encryption in this case. There's a lot of debate in security circles, and has been for years, right? This is going back to certainly 90s, but even before that, about fundamentally weakening the encryption algorithms, right? This is encryption with a capital E. There's none of that happening in this case. The government did not ask Apple to weaken encryption in this case. It's also not about privacy, right? Apple hands over customer data all the time. In this case, it's the mechanism they're objecting to, right? So there's a lot of debate about privacy and what's reasonable and confidentiality and surveillance, and yet none of these things are features in this case.
To be clear, you know, as we talk about the greater conversation of weakening encryption or controlling encryption, I think, as most of the people in this room realize, and I think we all know, encryption is basically, it's just math. And it's out there, it's public, it's open source. And if we tell one party they can't use encryption, another party will. It's a bit like trying to legislate the use of long division or banning the number 13 in certain circumstances. It doesn't make sense.
Triskaidekaphobia is a real thing.
Well, so if it is a math question, if it is a fairly simple technology, then why is one response of companies that have come into the crosshairs of this to wear encryption like a badge of honor, to use it more than ever in their marketing, and to use it as a tool of confidence for their customers? Why are they doing that?
I think in the world that we live in, that Misha's describing, where we have seen since 9/11, starting with the Patriot Act, continuing through all of the Snowden revelations, some overreach, right? And because we haven't had the debate that I'm talking about, and the framework for how we want this to function has not been clearly articulated in the world in which we live, we're leaving those questions up to operators who have very specific goals, right? The law enforcement is about investigating and prosecuting crimes, and they want all the tools available to them, and they are trying to do their job as best they can. And having the bigger debate is how we create oversight and how we create transparency. And because we're not having those things, I think the security of data is something that more consumers are aware of than ever. I don't think that means that we're necessarily more educated about security. I think the realities of what is secure and what is not is something that is nuanced and technically nuanced in ways that a lot of people don't understand, right? Like, just because I have encryption turned on my phone doesn't mean it's a secure device, right? Like, there's lots of ways to still surveil me right? Just even if I have sort of the encryption turned on my hard drive. But I do think that companies are looking to try to provide, they're responding to consumer demand at some level, even if it's not hyper educated.
I'll take slight exception with that, and primarily because I think it's important to kind of pause and appreciate the moment we're in. I think Charles and I have been in this industry in the security industry for over 20 years. It's virtually impossible to get any IT provider, any vendor, to pay attention to security properly and actually design it into their products. This is a fairly new development, right? And in the past, it's been very difficult to get anybody to take security relevant at the product level. Microsoft finally became a very good security company, but only after years of really embarrassing missteps. So why is it all of a sudden we're sitting here on the stage debating the merits of a phone that's designed so well that nobody can get into it? And we have to turn to courts to resolve this issue. Something happened on 9/11 that started to pull these issues of privacy and government overreach out of balance. And that's one of the reasons why the IT providers right now are finding ways to absolve themselves of this responsibility. I actually don't believe
that you think some of these lapses in security can be traced back to 9/11 and some of these companies turning the other way?
I think it's lapses in the balance in how government exercises their authority for surveillance and investigations that led us to this point. It was fascinating that President Obama was here, and he still doesn't seem to grasp this point, that the whole reason he's here at South by Southwest, appealing to people that, into their better senses, that we really can't protect you if you don't let us do our job and do investigations. There's still not a realization that the government policy is what led us to this point, right? That's how we ended up in this situation. And every single vendor I know of right now has a team working really hard to make sure that they can't decrypt phones because it's bad for business, right? The industry has suffered, I think, tremendously because of government overreach, and I think this is a reaction to it.
But to be fair, no one ever gets credit for the crises they avert, and we don't have full information about what the government has been able to avert because of some of this information. The head of the NSA testified in front of Congress and said that the data collection that was previously exposed by Edward Snowden helped lead to thwarting an attack against the New York Stock Exchange, for instance. That's one anecdote. But do you think
the NSA is also, most of the NSA conversation, they're very pro strong encryption. Like they're wildly against the idea of us weakening the basic sort of principles of security infrastructure at this stage of the game. Like, we're in a world where, given where we are with computing, it's right now, strong, well-implemented encryption is sort of one of the fundamental ways that we restrict the theater around where we have to worry about penetration. And this is something that, Charles, you and I have talked about a bunch.
Exactly, and keep in mind, it's not just about protecting from overreach from government or something like that. It's about protecting consumers from criminals. A full 100 million healthcare records last calendar year were compromised in the United States. That means 1 in 3 Americans had some level of healthcare data compromised by attackers. And if you're thinking about that in sort of what it means to you terms, it's a pretty good argument for consumer interest in privacy, security, and that's very difficult for consumers to quantitate. I mean, for me, I can reverse engineer my devices at home and figure out just how secure whatever it is. But for the average consumer, they have to rely on things like encryption and knowing that their companies that they purchase from stand behind them. And I think that plays a heavy hand into this. And we're talking about motivation and the shifts. I think the reason you're seeing the shift now is pretty much everyone that I talk to, at least, has been touched on some level by compromise, whether it's having credit card data taken or healthcare records or whatever it is.
So how do we educate consumers better about what encryption is and how to protect themselves if what you're saying is true, Charles, that most Americans find out about this because they were compromised?
Well, I don't know that it's some sort of easy path for education to the end consumer, But you know, I know that most of the companies out there take their client data and privacy very seriously. I mean, the companies that come to us for security testing, for instance, are very often looking at their consumer products and saying, hey, these active threats that are out there, how could they attack this consumer product? How, you know, what vulnerabilities might this have that we can fix and protect not only our consumers, but the public at large?
I also think it's a little bit unrealistic to expect that we're going to have like a deeply technical public conversation about the math behind encryption and different.
Well, it's long division, right? It's easy.
Right.
Yeah.
We figured it all out.
And the number 13. Don't forget
Yes.
the number 13.
Yes, clearly. That's actually not the conversation that we probably need or want to try to have, but at a higher altitude around this balancing test that I referred to before about the relationship between the relative value of security and the relative value of safety and how these things interplay. And then our policymaker, our leaders need to articulate values. Our policymakers need to set policy that's consistent with those values. And then technology companies need to be responsible for compliance and implementation. But that's a collaborative process that requires trust, that requires participation from a lot of actors. And both, I think, Misha, to your point, I think the appetite for collaboration is low. I think trust is low. And I think that is another reason why, you know, a lot of, I refer to how black and white this debate gets, like having these like pop culture Jack Bauer scenario references in this very serious fabric of our democracy conversation is not helping, right? Because that's just not, that level of legislating and policymaking from a place of fear and crisis is not going to lead to good outcomes in something that has so many high-order impacts on people.
We can't. And I think we habitually miss that context. It's really fascinating to watch what people respond to, and I think this case again captures people's attention is because it's a phone and everybody's got one of these, right? It's really easy to identify with this device, and it makes it really easy to impart everything you've ever been anxious about when it comes to privacy in this particular case, even though it has very little to do with it. I'll look at it this way. In the span of the last month or so, right, this case has become a major topic in the media, but at the same time, very quietly, FBI relaxed their rules around their ability to access NSA data that we already know isn't always legally collected, right? They operate very much in a gray area. To me, this phone case is not all that relevant, but yet FBI's access to NSA data is a really big deal. And this is where, unfortunately, the public opinion has to kind of galvanize behind the right issues. Otherwise, we'll never deal with these things, right?
Charles?
We need to stop collaborating in 140 characters. We need to have face-to-face
It's so hard to say
meetings.
at South by Southwest.
I know.
I agree with you.
I feel like they're going to rise up and rebel against me for saying it, but we need to, maybe it should be, it's not about phones in general. We need to put down our phones. We need to stop. We need to stop typing. So remember those old things, they were called dry erase boards in meeting rooms. And
I think I've seen a few of those around here, actually.
Yeah, and
They're still around.
Technology is still actively used, yes.
it was great. Before video conferencing, we used to get in the same room as an industry with the politicos and everybody else, and we actually would talk through these problems. And it didn't take a South by Southwest panel to put together people to talk about the policies. And I think it's important that as we leave this room, we continue to have this discussion and we have it more meaningfully and bring the power players together.
But Charles, let's be clear, this is happening. It's just not going well, right? The administration has reached out to Silicon Valley and they have tried to mend fences, and these conversations happen behind closed doors, and I think I understand why they did.
Misha, where do you think the misunderstanding is?
I think the fundamental misunderstanding is in exactly what Michael's been talking about. It's between the balance between what the government should be able to do and is able to do lawfully versus what they actually do and the practical impact they have on both the industry and private lives. I think that balance has been drifting out of alignment for about a decade at this point, and it doesn't seem to be getting better, right? That to me is actually a central issue. It's not that this conversation, we're not trying to have this conversation, we just haven't taken enough corrective steps in order for somebody in the tech industry to say, you know, I trust my government finally,
What do you
and
think
they're going to be a partner.
What do you think we could do? I mean, I think that's the rebuilding of trust, I think, is fundamental to collaboration, right? If we're going to participate in a way that is honest and sober and open, like we have to reduce the temperature, the sort of the public sort of intensity of vilification and dogma. Like all of that has to come down. But are there other things that we can do to get at this? And to be clear, like I don't speak for the administration. I think this is a grayer issue than we're willing to let it be.
You know, I wasn't born in this country, so I was born in Moscow. So coming from Russia, when you come to America, you kind of absorb certain American principles and you take them for granted, right? At some point, right, the accountability and the sense of rule of law when it comes to government access to private data started to decay. And one of the first steps in order to rebuilding trust with the industry and people, I think, is to reintroduce that concept. But you know, ever since noted disclosures, what we've seen a lot of is, you know, the whistleblowers continue to be persecuted, and nobody's been held accountable for the overreach. And as a result, I'm not surprised these conversations behind closed doors are not going well, and I'm not surprised that IT companies continue to fund very aggressive programs that enable them to not ever have to give out any information and be physically unable to do so. They will win this battle. That's inevitable, right?
Technically.
Technically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's true. And I think one of the things that we need to step back from this sort of weak versus strong encryption question is more about recoverable and unrecoverable data, right? That most users, especially in consumer device contexts, want, you know, want a recovery path. They want a reset my password. They want, you know, you go to File Vault and iOS and you can store a key with Apple. That there is a mechanism for recovery in many cases. And are there circumstances in which we want, because we've decided it's valuable and important, and we've created oversight and mechanisms of transparency, that we want the government to be able to avail themselves of that path?
Let me give you a very practical usability question, right? My wife got locked out of her iPad because my kids put in the password too many times. This literally happened to her. I had no idea that the device will auto-destruct if you do that, right? And I had no idea that you can't recover the data. There's physically no way to do that, because let's not forget, this particular case is about kind of an ancient version.
And your wife's not even a criminal, but she wants her photos.
So she desperately wanted to recover her data. If you asked her as a user, what do you want at this particular moment? She really wanted to get her phone back, right? But yet that wasn't possible. Whoever built this feature wasn't thinking about the user when they built it, right? That's not what it was built for, right?
So is it about that one feature? Are there features on specific devices that you think should come into the modern era? And Michael, to your question about, is there some data that we think should be recoverable? Play devil's advocate. I know most people in here are in favor of the strongest encryption possible, and very few of you said that you believe that data should be recoverable by law enforcement in cases of national security. But what is the worst case scenario?
Sure.
If data is completely unrecoverable?
So to be clear, I am in favor of the strongest encryption possible. I also think that there are consequences associated with that level of privacy and civil liberty, and we have to be okay with them. We have to talk about acceptable risk, which is this is a very uncomfortable conversation. And this is a conversation that politicians are, in our current climate, are loath to have at any level, right? Because they are instantaneously vilified as soft on crime or soft on terror in these ways that are just dishonest, right? It's not a sober conversation. If we think we have in our society, we have digital crimes, right? And the job of law enforcement is the investigation and prosecution of crime. Is not intelligence gathering. It's a different discipline. It requires different skills, different capacities, different capabilities. That blurring is very problematic. But in the context of law enforcement for digital crimes, we want digital evidence to be able to prosecute criminals. Child pornography, financial crime. There are a number of things that become, we either need to be okay prosecuting these things with data that happens around a fully unrecoverable encrypted device that we can't get into, right? There's lots of connections to other things. It's very unusual. Like the use case of a device existing in a vacuum with no connection to anything else is very, very unusual, right? So, but we may have to be okay with the fact that we're going to prosecute somebody based on all of those other things without having the actual evidence. And I think that might be okay, but that's a serious conversation, and I'm not a lawyer. Like I'm not sure that's okay. I want to talk about that. Like I want to have a debate about those questions, and do we in fact need to back up and say, wait a second, are we talking about prosecuting someone with no evidence? Like this is what I'm saying about like avoiding the Jack Bauer scenario about like the terrorist, and if we don't get into the phone, the subway is going to explode. Like that pop culture intensity is entertaining, but
Charles,
but super unproductive.
Do you think people can get comfortable with the idea, and do you think we're close to being able to get comfortable with the idea that data will die with a device?
You know, it's interesting, and we talked about this yesterday. You talk about the data at rest on the device, the data that is, whatever consumer electronic device it is, that sits on the device. But, and you made reference to it, all the
relative
points
value.
all the points that device connects to. If you think about it, the IPs that they hit with their web browser, the calls that they make from their device. There's a lot of data that sits around it, and I think we tend to get hyper-focused about the data at rest, and maybe it's high-profile cases, what have you, but it's a much larger discussion. And it's not as if that data gets there via telepathy. I'm sure Apple's working on that at this very moment.
This is why the courts are not the best place to define this. It's not exactly a scalpel, right? It's not exactly a finely tuned instrument for policymaking. This is fairly complex stuff, and this is where I think you in the audience might find my opinion schizophrenic, right? I'm making a strong case for privacy, yet I'm having trouble rationalizing the notion that we have law enforcement agents that are unable to do their job because they don't have access to basic tooling that makes it possible, right? You only need to be connected to one criminal case personally in order to change your position on that, right?
Yeah, well, and I think that's the question where our expectations of law enforcement are unrealistic,
right.
are unfair, right? We're putting the fact that we haven't settled this and we don't have a mechanism for handling this question in a way that is sort of sober and honest means we're putting the FBI in this position where if we don't come up with a public process for this that we're comfortable with, we are in fact going to be pushing them toward black hat tactics, right? Because if our expectations don't change with our values, then we're making some extremely unrealistic demands on people whose jobs are to protect us.
This is something that corporations have faced for years, though. And if you look at the incident response teams of various corporations, they've dealt with encrypted devices. They've dealt with the need to reconstruct what happened. They've dealt with compromises where the attackers have used encryption. And it's a much bigger picture item. And you can't just look at this single consumer electronic device and not look at the bigger picture, and not look at all the things that feed into it, and look at that greater point of information. And it's easy for us sitting at home to basically get hyper-focused on the consumer electronic device, but the person using it has a lot more information that surrounds them.
So much more, right?
Yeah.
I also
But
think
if you write legislation based on devices that exist today, inevitably, in 50 to 100 years, we'll be having the same we won't.
Well, no,
Someone else will be
unless
having the
medical
same
device.
discussion.
yeah, that's the other panel.
About applying an ancient law
Yeah, well,
to
I
new
think
issues.
this is where using courts for a technical solution to a very specific technical problem or legislating implementation is very dangerous, right? Because you're conflating implementation and technical rigor with a policy and values process that aren't necessarily well suited for each other, right? So this is the idea that we would allow the courts to compel the FBI to compel a private company to write software for them is a pretty dangerous idea.
Or hand over the source code.
Which they'll never do, and shouldn't. But that's a pretty, but it's because they're desperate, right? And I think this is the other piece of the conversation about balancing and relative value that we need to try to have, and it's hard and uncomfortable, is what is the value of the data on this device? Right, let's just use it the panel's called It's Not About an iPhone, but let's talk about this specific device for just in this one context. It's now been a few months, right? For the purposes of intelligence gathering, there's obviously opportunities for pattern matching and other things based on potential numbers that might be in this device, but the likelihood of the intelligence value of this phone being high is actually quite low. And I don't know the state of the current investigation, but this shooter is dead. He is not going to be prosecuted. So why is getting into this device today important? I know what law enforcement will say is we need to settle this now so that next time it happens, we can do it quickly. Fine. I agree with that, because I think not having a solution to this is why we're in this mess. It's why we're having this conversation. It's why so many of these questions that are so fundamental. I mean, I'm talking about like the fabric of civil liberties in the country. And I think it needs to happen at that level, or we aren't going to have answers. But again, they're in a position where they're looking for a court-ordered technical solution to a problem. That's scary to me. That is, in fact, a very scary aspect of this case, because what happens when they want to compel some other company to do something else? Or some other government wants to compel some other company to do something else? Like whether or not, there's been a lot of debate about whether this creates precedent or not. Whether it creates, sort of in stare decisis terms, a legal precedent that is going to be used over and over again, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. But in the context of public opinion and international norms, this is a precedent of behavior, period, full stop. And we got to think about the implications of that in other contexts.
Misha, we heard earlier today from Slack CEO Stuart Butterfield, who said he believes that the NSA is capable of the skills to crack the phone, and that this case was cherry-picked by the government to be able to either write a law or push forward some other political agenda. Do you agree with that?
I think it's possible. I wish this whole case had been settled behind closed doors, even though I typically advocate for transparency. I don't like this particular case, right? Lots of people died, right? And in terms of deciding on just emotional appeal, this is not the one I want used to decide privacy matters, right? So I do wish that this was a private conversation between FBI and Apple, and I do wish that Apple had complied, and in very quiet terms. I think there is a way to do this without giving malicious code to FBI. They could have taken the phone, extracted data from it, because I think the technical solution is viable, and called it a day, right? So I don't know exactly how it ended up in courts. I think if it ended up in courts on purpose to set precedent, then that's unfortunate, because that's, as we discussed, it's a bad question to ask in a bad forum, right?
Well, I'm curious, do you think that the intelligence agencies truly have the know-how to tackle some of these issues, or do you think that if they don't, that they should throw a ton of resources behind hiring people to be able to solve these issues without
there's a version of me before Snowden disclosures, and there's a version of me after Snowden disclosures. I don't take anything for granted.
I think that's true for everybody
anymore. And even the latest revelations, which were not related to Snowden, but just the level of technology that we see disclosed, where you can write micro firmware that runs on hard drives, right, which doesn't even attach itself to operating systems, is pretty phenomenal. We're talking about a technology that was implemented 10 years ago, roughly, right? It's very possible that NSA has the ability to do so. It's also important to recognize that NSA and FBI are two very different organizations. And look, this is where, again, these lines get blurred, and unfortunately so, right? The blast radius of this particular case, let's say we decide that government should be able to compel companies to break phones, for example, right? The blast radius of that particular decision is pretty low, actually, right? We're talking about obvious criminals. We're talking about lawful investigations. There's very little of that that spills out into mass surveillance sphere, right, where intelligence agencies operate, right? So So I do think NSA has the ability to do so because this is an active, because what's at stake here is intelligence. It is surprising that they're not involved, and it is surprising that they haven't extracted this data. And I think it does point towards this being handcrafted as a precedent-setting case, which is, again, the wrong way to solve this particular issue.
When we think about the solution to this or the lasting impact of this debate that is not about an iPhone, Charles, to not have an emotional reaction to this, to not have that visceral reaction to what you read in the press, how much time do you need? A month, 6 months, a year?
I guess it depends on who you're talking about, because for me, at least, I'm not somebody that's going to go out and decide policy. I'm not an elected official. I'm a security researcher. So, I run a team that makes things break and finds vulnerabilities. I have a pretty cool job. But what we're focused on, at least, is the security of devices, the security of devices that we make, the devices of our clients, and improving the overall security posture of devices everywhere. And so one of the things I think about this argument that is interesting for me is this is an argument that, frankly, I've been having for years. I mean, this is drink cooler conversation at my office for long before this case ever existed. So,
but less so in the cloakroom at the Senate, right? Which is part of the problem.
And
right?
that is exactly the problem. And I think what needs to happen is that conversation that occurs at security companies, at technology companies around the world needs to move out of the closed doors of just one break room. And you say that earlier that those conversations haven't been fruitful. I think we need to both sides need to kind of swallow our pride and come together. I mean,
it's hard, right? Juniper just announced there's a back door in their software, and they can't figure out how it got there, right? You know better than I do that there's a very, very small number of people and agencies that could have introduced that back door in there. I don't know which government it was, but it certainly wasn't an individual, right? So it keeps happening, right? It's very difficult to say let bygones be bygones because that balance is still drifting out of alignment, right? It's happening still today, right?
I think it's interesting, though, because the security community, and we talked about this in the green room before coming out here, security community used to be very involved in policy decisions. It was a point of pride to go down to Capitol Hill and testify. You still see some of that, but you don't see nearly the degree of that I would have envisioned in 1997 when a whole bunch of at the time hippies with long hair, we were
famous loft.
It was a different era. Went and took group photos in front of Capitol Hill. I think,
but that's the thing is a lot of it was disregarded, right? And it didn't. The conversation didn't proceed to the level that it needed to create new frameworks, right? And I think.
Although I do think we settled the debate on the right side of the issue with the Clipper chip, for example, right? Mm-hmm. It's happened before, and I do think that those dispassionate arguments have worked out before. I think it's demonstrably true that trying to decide policy matters immediately following attacks has huge repercussions and usually not good ones, right? I mean, we're talking about not just the Patriot Act, right? I mean, we're talking about France, cradle of democracy, right? And going in an opposite direction because they had a very traumatic experience. So is the right time to settle policy issues right after a lot of people die?
Perhaps not, but laws don't get written in a vacuum either. It takes those events to bring these conversations public. I'm curious, you have all advocated to get people in a room to talk about this behind closed doors. Who's your dream team? If you had to pick 3 to 5 people that you think are the smartest people you know on encryption, the most well-educated, the most well-intentioned, to go to Capitol Hill to talk about this, who are they?
I think I'll get to that once again. I think some of this Congressman Hurd spoke on the panel earlier this week and has been working tirelessly and is pulling together a commission. So some of these rooms are happening. Right? I don't want to paint this as if there is no discussion and as if there aren't people working really hard to try to push a positive conversation. I just think it's very newly being elevated to a level of conversation that is easy enough for the public to engage at a values level where it's an accessible conversation to everyone, and that it's not a technical conversation about long division and the number 13, right? So I think these things are starting to happen, but it needs to continue to be elevated so that we aren't talking about a single phone and we aren't talking about a single exploit. In terms of, I think the dream team is in some ways sort of the predictable experts that you'd expect to see, the people who are heads of security at large institutional technology companies and people from the intelligence community and security researchers who are thinking about, if continued progress in quantum computing continues to go forward, this conversation is going to be really different in a decade or sooner, I don't know, than it is right now, because all of the tools we're using right now are going to be completely obviated, right? So there's this blend of sort of intelligence gathering and people on the sort of front lines of law enforcement and sort of challenges around terrorism and extremism and financial crime and all these different areas. There's a lot of industry heads, and then we need to get policymakers to be in a room where they are willing to be honest about the concept of acceptable risk and balancing tests.
The story of civic pride and private industry working hand in hand with government, the team that fixed healthcare.gov and so on, that's not going to happen in the security space, right? I don't see that happening in that particular segment. A couple of years ago, I was this was sometime after Snowden disclosures, but I was in London talking to chief security officers of very large organizations. And they were very distrustful of American companies at the time, right? And that's considering that GCHQ is just as implicated in government overreach as NSA, and if anything, they should distrust their own government more so than American companies. But it certainly has an impact on our business. But frankly, we're not that big of a company, right? You probably know better than I do. You think anybody's picked up the phone and called Cisco and said, sorry, you guys dropped that quarter and billions of dollars of your market cap vaporized, right? I'm not sure if that's happened yet, right?
InfoSec has collaborated elsewhere, though. If you look at threat research, for instance, I mean, we last year rolled out an initiative called the X-Force Exchange, and we've gotten participation from 5 of the top 10 banks. It's a free service, It's 6 of the top 10 retailers, 6 of the top 10 auto manufacturers.
But those stories of Howard Hughes working with U.S. government, right? Those mass projects, that's not going to happen in this industry because the level of distrust is extremely high.
But that's an anachronism. I mean, look at it in the modern era. I mean, we can come together. And if you look at it in terms of threat, I think one of the things that drives the collaboration when it comes to threat is there's a shot clock. There's a clock ticking down. There's an immediate danger. I mean, that's why they call it threat. And that imposing figure tends to build collaboration. I'm not saying we need an imposing figure when it comes to the encryption mess, but I think there needs to be a driver, and perhaps this is it.
Sure, but actually, Misha, I think bringing up healthcare.gov is actually a meaningful model potentially for how to engage in this, because you have a massive, very public challenge that the government is going through that is getting covered in the media. You have, and I think the way the White House responded to that failure and brought people together, the whole birth, the work that Todd Park and Jen Palka and Haley Van Dyke and Mikey Dickerson have done over the course of the last several years, building USDS, building 18F, responding to a reality that we didn't have the certain capabilities that we needed to provide good service to the government,
humility
to the people.
And accountability were in the picture.
And humility is a really important word, right? Because it
means
to
come by with this privacy issue.
What are we good at and what are we not? And where can we find people? The reality was, as soon as we said, are there people who are willing to help us solve this problem? People said yes, right? And people are still, Todd Park is bringing more and more people into the government.
Do you think this is an issue that people are willing to say they're not good at because the stakes are so high?
I think we won't let them. And I think this is a place where I think the media and press bear some responsibility for how we talk about this publicly, and for deepening their understanding and their willingness to talk about the gray areas in technology. And this is hard, right? When you see sort of political reporters being forced into highly technical reporting on things like encryption, that's not an easy thing to do, right? And I'm not suggesting that it's easy, but I do think that being willing to tamp down the the headline, the clickbait headline in favor of something that's more gray and more moderate actually helps this be an elevated conversation. Because I do think the attention of the failure of healthcare.gov helped create an opportunity and an appetite for humility and change and self-reflection. And I think those things are required here to take steps forward.
Do we need total failure? Maybe
I hope
maybe
not.
That,
I don't think we do. I don't think we do. I think it is possible for us together to sort of embrace the demands of our values and have a serious conversation about the things that we care about as a country and the kind of model we want to be for how citizens interact with a government of limited power that's in service of its people. And we can have a conversation at a level of sobriety and honesty that takes into account things like concepts like acceptable risks and doesn't devolve into this, there can be no threats, there can be no crime. It doesn't, we are capable of better. But we have to reach for better. And there are a lot of people right now making that very, very hard in politics.
We have broadened this conversation out quite a bit from the phone to encryption, to technology and government, to our values as a country and what we're eventually striving for. But I know that people in the audience and people watching online must have questions for our panel here. So let's get to some of those. The first question comes from Twitter and says, isn't this debate really about the limits or lack thereof of the federal government's legal authority? Now, we've acknowledged that none of us are lawyers up here, so
sure. No, but
that is the disclaimer. Michael, you want to take that?
I'm not a lawyer, but I play one on TV. I think fundamentally this is at the heart of the question. Do we want there to be a mechanism for this or not? Right, and to the point I was talking about, there is a recovery path in many of these systems. Are there circumstances and is there a mechanism by which we want government to be able to access that? That is what we should be debating. And I think the problem with this case is that's not what we're debating. The case is about a technical answer to a specific problem on a specific
And it's not a
request.
good proxy for it, right?
It's a terrible place to have that debate.
If you take that as a macro question, I agree that that should be the right question we're asking. We certainly didn't need to wait for this case to start having that debate. And this debate does not answer any of those questions definitively or even to any degree of satisfaction, right? For example, right? I think I've already spoken about the fact that the relative downside of us landing in a bad place on this, right, and compelling Apple to do this isn't all that bad, yet there's a lot of government overreach that we already know what happens, and it hasn't been corrected. There's FISA courts that are still secret. If companies try to challenge them, those challenges are usually sealed. If they try to challenge those and they get thrown in contempt of court. I mean, there's a lot of this stuff that isn't out in the open. This case is kind of the tip of the iceberg, right?
But the president's comments when he spoke on Friday were that the way that encryption is going means that eventually we will all be walking around with the equivalent of a Swiss bank account in our pocket. On one hand, you do have the question of what should the legal authority be, but on the other hand, you do have the question of, is encryption, the way that it has been developed, making it impossible, regardless of what the legal authority is, making it impossible.
If the future is Orwellian, then I think we are going to end up with Swiss bank accounts in our pockets, right? It's technically possible to build that, and I think I think lack of rational settlement of these issues will drag you into that situation. Where
but this is Pandora's box. I mean, encryption's out there. Again, from the beginning of the panel, it's open source. It's out there, and I think that we, as an industry, tend to get hyper-focused on specific use cases, and or even abuse cases, and I think we need to take a step back and look at the larger picture.
Well, and I think there's a really important question implicit in this Swiss bank account example is, why would someone want that? Like, what is driving me as a just person in the world to need that, to think that that's a good idea, that's something I want to invest in, or it's something important for my life that I would need an unbreakable, unidentifiable, unrecoverable act. The fact that that is even being postured as something that I might need suggests an environment where things are out of balance.
That's right.
And so that is true. Also, maybe that's okay, right? Like, again, I'm back to this, like, this is just, we just have to talk about it, right? We shouldn't posit some extreme outcome as an end to the conversation, as a way of killing off the debate about something, right? This is why I keep joking about like Jack Bauer scenarios, right? It's like, because of course everybody says, if you could break in the phone to save 1 million lives, there's almost no one that would say no. But that's not a reasonable.
If you could go back in time, if you could see yesterday's newspapers,
of course, and that's not the sober conversation that I think we need.
A reminder to our audience: you can submit your questions with the hashtag #AskEncryption. But the backdrop, Misha, is the fact that this is a globalized economy, and the companies who are creating these devices are companies whose growth is coming from China, from Russia, from the Middle East. And I wonder how different you think the conversation would be if they didn't have such huge constituencies in those places.
Well,
I think it's already difficult, right? I mean, the 60 Minutes this weekend, right? There was a story about the founder of Telegraph, right? The downside scenarios of getting this wrong are pretty ominous, right? And we're talking about the equivalent of, of Zuckerberg in Russia essentially getting thrown out of the country and founding Telegraph, which is highly encrypted chat mechanism that he believes shouldn't be crackled by the government. And I think his personal experiences, right, of popular protests being broken down in Russia, and I think if you trace back the way that it happened in Russia, it was pretty unfortunate, the level of access the government had to public communications, right? So those scenarios are not that far out of reach, right?
Right.
You have to look at China and Russia and see that, the downside of giving up on privacy is pretty bad, right?
And that's actually where I do think, you said before that the blast radius of this particular case is relatively small, but because it is the tip of an iceberg, I actually think it's super problematic.
Well, I say that because I think there's a difference between mass surveillance and communication mechanisms and physical infrastructure.
I think that's true. I think you're technically true. In all dimensions, that's true. But I also think that this case creates some momentum that is dangerous around how other governments will react with this. How even our own government might behave differently under different contexts, right? We're not only, when we create policy, we are generally creating policy for an infinite future, right? Because that we may or may not be able to predict, and so the higher order consequences are hard to see around. But we don't know what our country might look like in a decade, and so we have to be careful about a point in time solution that we may or may not be able to see around the corner of, and we may or may not see how this gets interpreted in other places, right? That this becomes, like I said, it may not be a legal precedent here, it may or may not. I don't understand how it wouldn't be, but I'm not a lawyer. Again, I keep coming back to that one. But how this is an example of how to behave. It is an example of a demonstration of our relationship between government and limited government power and civil liberties. It is a demonstration of those things. And we need to behave like everyone's watching, because they are.
Speaking of outside the US, we do have another question that comes from Twitter. It's from Kate, and she asks, what are your thoughts on the UK's investigatory powers bill?
This may be a little too specific. I don't know the details on the bill, so I'd be really loath to try to guess.
I'm gonna take the fifth on this one.
Okay.
Sorry, Kate.
That's quite all right. We'll go to the next one. Andrew asks, if the US government could compel companies to break their own devices, would foreign citizens still trust US products? It goes to the point about the customers of these companies outside the US
Of course
would
not.
they stop buying them?
It is going to have an impact on people's trust in the U.S. government and in American companies. It absolutely will. And it also assumes that, that consumer devices and the iPhone is the only device available to criminals, right? That we have lots of evidence of, criminals and other things building their own devices that have, Apple can't crack. They're not iPhones. So this will inevitably have an economic impact that is extremely hard to predict. But it presupposes a depth to the value of doing this that I think is misleading.
This technology isn't some sort of witchcraft. It's publicly available. It's open source. It's well documented. The barrier to entry is not all that great.
Well, you have to be pretty technically sophisticated to build your own phone. Let's be honest about what we're talking about. But all of the building blocks are there and available to you.
Exactly, and that's my point. I'm not saying you're.
My mom's not building a phone.
I'm not saying my friends and family are building their own phones anytime soon. But at the same time, I mean, the encryption, the implementation.
I totally agree.
You're trying to herd cats at that point.
Is there a real economic impact in your view, Charles? Do the dollars and cents go down if this happens?
I don't want to get into sort of the consumer side of it personally, but I do see that I do see that our corporate clients place a very high value in the privacy of their customers, and we place an incredible value in our customers' privacy. So I think that there is a lot of value.
And I think
this case is difficult to evaluate in a vacuum. I'll give you a scenario where I think the consumers worldwide actually benefit. Let's assume that that the government is able to compel Apple to break this particular mechanism. Again, it's not breaking encryption, it's actually breaking the self-destruct mechanism and enabling them to brute force a password. Let's say that they're able to convince them to do that. If, at the same time, right, we also rein in our kind of unbounded mass surveillance and get it under control, right? If we make sure that when we run certain operations, there is limits to what we can do. There is good checks, sets of checks and balances in place when our own Congress doesn't get hacked by our own intelligence agencies, right? Which looks completely dysfunctional, right? I think if we were able to put that on balance, overall, you would see consumers worldwide trust us more, not less, right? Right? Look, this situation where they don't trust us, that's already happened. That train has left the station, right?
That's where we are now.
That's right.
We just have a couple minutes left, but I do want to get to this question. It's from Thor. It's also from Twitter, and he says, are there policy models used by other countries that are examples to consider or alternatively to avoid? I think we probably all know which ones to avoid without saying them out loud, but are there other examples by other countries that we should consider?
I mean, I think, Misha, you brought up the example of France as a challenge, right? As an example of the danger of legislating during crisis out of fear and uncertainty, and the undermining of sort of of fundamental values that can happen in panic and can happen when we're angry, and that our expectations and desire for justice can make it hard to be honest about the real value of some of these things. I think any process, and I don't have a specific example of sort of a positive way this has played out in other countries, but we've seen, thinking about the example of healthcare.gov, we've seen Bracken in the UK and the digital services there have really positive, user-centric, citizen-centric conversations about how government can take care of people. And I think Estonia has done this well. I think there are examples, we've seen examples of how government can get good at technology. And so this isn't magic, right? It is not voodoo. It is just hard.
The obvious
and it's
examples,
a hard conversation.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
Obvious examples of what to avoid, right? I mean, we don't have to talk about Russia and China anymore because I think it's obvious that there are things happening in those countries where breach of privacy is commonplace and
Is standard practice.
right? I think there's the other side of that equation where in Central Europe, right, for example, in Germany, right, we as a company don't operate in Germany because there's nothing for us to do there, right? Germany, for the most part, doesn't trust the cloud, right? They really don't like handing over their data to forget about U.S. companies. I mean, cloud providers in general, right? So this position where privacy should trump all other matters, again, is out of alignment, out of balance, and doesn't make sense. It all leads to kind of balkanization of the internet, which is a net negative for us all, right? So I think that's one of the obvious models to avoid out there, right? The obvious answer that we should always err on the side of privacy and that should always be the only consideration is a wrong one, right? To me, devices matter less than networks. Free networks that are interconnected matter more than balkanized networks where there's a sense of privacy, but in fact what you're dealing with is actually a closed network.
Yeah. And if we're not careful, we undermine the potential and power for growth and empowerment and development that the internet has become.
That's right.
Right? I am not in the camp of infinite access equals everybody gets, rainbows and puppies. But there is this potential, this generative potential of the internet that we can damage if we're not careful and we do this wrong.
We are just out of time, but I have to ask you before we go, at South by Southwest next year, will we have a law? Will we have a court decision? Will we have tied this issue up?
I think it's very unlikely that we have a law by then. I think it is quite likely that there is some kind of decision just in terms of how courts.
Will we have text of a law?
I think we already have some proposals, right? Things like the things that are coming out of the process that Congressman Hurd has been driving in Congress. I think if we are serious about this and we're willing to come to the table, we can have a lot of that. We can have the building blocks of a new framework. This is something we can start tomorrow. This is the one thing that I want to leave with some optimism about this, is that this is a very solvable problem. The humility required and the steps that can be taken for government to focus on building trust, these are things that we can do now. We're not waiting for anything but the sort of better angels of our nature to take over and let us step forward to doing something better.
There's an implied finality in your statement. Even if we get to the point where we have a law, where we get to whatever.
This conversation isn't over.
The conversation isn't over. This needs to be a constantly evolving, changing thing with society. This needs to be ongoing discussions. This needs to be ongoing collaboration for as long as we have technology.
It's an election year, so I'm not sure if we're going to have a law because perhaps the only worst thing to do than overreact after a massive terror attack is to try to pass a law like this during the election cycle. I do hope that people get behind this issue. I think it could be an important issue in the election, for example, and I hope if President Obama's here.
It's not a partisan issue. That's what we've learned.
Well, unfortunately, I don't get a sense that this is a issue that people really are behind and people really passionately care about. I think if President Obama comes here next year, I'm hoping there's demonstrations for one side or the other on this issue, right? And the stories that get written about his presence here are not just about Torchy's tacos, and Torchy's is awful, right? I mean, that's just not a good taco, right?
This is the thing that people react to.
I'm gonna go pro Torchy's on this panel.
But that's exactly my point, right? We got to get people galvanized behind this issue because somebody's got to apply some kind of pressure on their elected officials and not just view this as a sideshow that plays out in the courts because they're not going to decide right.
Well, you guys have an important role in this conversation. We appreciate you bringing it to the stage here at South by. So thank you to my esteemed panelists, and thanks to our audience for being such great participants today.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Cool.